Turn up the volume in honor of International Amateur Radio Day. And this is Tesla Unwired broadcast, featuring a special lineup of ham radio enthusiasts. Baseball legend Joe Rudi, Ted Rappaport, the innovator who brought us 5G technology, and Ed Wilson, the vice president of the Suffolk County Radio Club. I'm your host, Marc Alessi, executive director of the Tesla Science Center. And we gathered this panel of radio champions to share their knowledge and stories of how radio transformed their lives and work. We're also going to explore the radio resurgence that's taking place in the world, as well as possibilities for the future of amateur radio. Let's start by meeting our guests and learning about their special connections to radio. Ted Rappaport. Ted's research has led to groundbreaking knowledge in wireless communications, including the millimeter wave technology that brought us 5G. He founded NYU Wireless and the research centers at the University of Texas, Austin, and Virginia Tech. Ted now serves as the David Lee Ernst Weber Professor at NYU with appointments in several departments. He is a fellow of the National Academy of Inventors and a member of the National Academy of Engineering and the Wireless History Foundation Hall of Fame. And most recently, the Tesla Science Center honored him as the Innovator of the Year at our gala last year. Welcome to the program today, Ted.
Hi, Mark. Great to be with you, and it's great to be with Joe Rudi, a great ham radio contester and a baseball hero of mine when I was a kid, and also Ed Wilson, 73, you guys.
That's and that brings me to Joe Rudi. Joe, as Ted said, is a baseball legend whose professional career spanned from 1967 to 1982. Joe is a three-time All-Star, three-time World Series champion, and three-time Gold Glove Award winner. He is also a longtime ham radio advocate who has been instrumental in promoting and developing this field. Thank you, Joe, for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here, and always fun. I enjoyed the last session we had with Tesla and the celebration there for Ted, and such a great outreach and getting all this out on the National Ham Radio Day is pretty awesome.
Thank you. And then finally, our third guest, Ed Wilson. Ed Wilson is a law enforcement professional who became a licensed amateur radio operator in 1993. His interests in radio include emergency communications, home brewing, and digital modes. Ed currently serves as community manager for the M17 project. I'm going to want to know more about that, Ed, a new open source digital radio protocol. He is also vice president of the Suffolk County Radio Club, which Suffolk County is where the Tesla Science Center is located. It's Long Island's oldest club, and they are often at our events right here at the Tesla campus. Ed, again, thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me, guys. It's my pleasure to be here.
So I'm going to throw out a question just to get us started. And first I'm going to ask you, Ted. I know your interest in ham radio started in your childhood. Can you tell us how you got introduced to ham radio?
Yeah, I was very lucky. My grandfather, Grandpa Carl, had an old shortwave radio. And when I was 5 years old, he introduced it to me, and I used to tune around and hear things and heard Morse code and single sideband. I was just fascinated. And later he gave me an old CB radio. I didn't realize it wouldn't work because it didn't have any crystals in it. But, I was a kid tinkering around, and by the time I was 12, I was playing with walkie-talkies. And then when I was 13, I was playing football. I call it the best break of my life because I broke my leg in 3 places. And I was laid up in a body cast in the hospital for 6 weeks, and then 6 months where all I could do is lay there. So my grandma bought me a shortwave radio. I listened around. I learned Morse code, taught myself Morse code. And after that, growing up in Indiana, Richmond, Indiana, Cambridge City, after I was out of the body cast, I walked up on crutches and hiked up to a ham, WB9NNO, Doc Woodward, the local veterinarian. he gave me my novice license, and then I started to teach adults ham radio, Morse code, and electric theory while I was a teenager. I think the love of radio started when I was 5, but it was ham radio that allowed me to develop my interest in teaching and communications and the love of wireless. I was inventing antennas as a kid, putting them on the roof of the house. I didn't know exactly how the theory worked, but that fascination, that magic of wireless has never left.
Oh, that's pretty obvious because you just helped light up the world with the latest generation of cell phones with 5G. And you could kind of draw the line all the way back to those early experiences with amateur radio. Joe, how about you? Did you get an early start also in ham radio?
I didn't get my license early on. I think my first encounter with DXing, I called it, was, well, I grew up on a dairy in my grandparents' dairy, and my grandfather had a big old Philco radio. It had the old curved top on it, if you remember those way back when. And he had a wire going out the window up into a tree. And I remember going in there at night and listening, and somehow I got into the thing with turning the knobs. I think he was the one that told me first that you could hear different stations at night than you could during the daytime. And I started keeping a little logbook of the stations I could hear, because I grew up in the Central Valley, about 100 miles east of San Francisco. And but during the day, as we all know, you're only going to hear local stuff on AM. And then at night, I'd hear Salt Lake City, LA, Seattle, all that kind of stuff. It was exciting to tune around and see what I could hear. And then obviously I got a little older, got into teenage years and sports and a few girls here and there. And anyway, my wife's listening, so I got to be careful there. Anyway.
So Joe, when you were a kid, was it radio, baseball, pizza, and girls in kind of that order, changing around?
Well, radio took a back seat probably from the time I was 10 or 11 years old. I was fairly large for my age, and so I was playing on 2 or 3 different teams from Little League to Babe Ruth when I was 10, 11, 12. Wow. And so that's really got started. I didn't get back into my first real encounter with ham radio, believe it or not. If you guys remember a gentleman by the name of Bo Belinsky, who was a great pitcher, threw a no-hitter with the Angels. Well, I played winter baseball with him down in Caracas, Venezuela, during the winter of 1968. And we all lived in the same condo tower thing. They put all the Americans. There was 3 teams in Caracas. And I got invited by Bo and his wife. Anyway, we went over to a friend's of his house that lived in Caracas. And there, you're either rich or really poor. And obviously this is a rich family, and the son had a tower that came out the roof of the house, and we got to go in there, and Bo would go over there a couple times a week and was able to, by getting into the phone lines there in LA, contact the ham there and able to talk to his family over the ham radio. So that was my real first introduction to it. And then I didn't really encounter it again until the mid 70s. We had moved to a new home out in Danville, California, once I got established with the A's out there. And we had moved up on the side of this hill in Danville, and right about 200 or 300 yards to the south of us on the same hill was a place called San Damiano Retreat, which was a Catholic retreat place. And one of the priests there, 2 of the brothers, and the handyman that sort of took care of the grounds were all hams. And the handyman lived down a little ways below there and had a tower, and that sort of piqued my interest. And I ended up starting to go down there in the evenings, especially on weekends or something when I had got home. And sat with him and started listening on the radio, and they were big baseball fans, so we just left them tickets all the time. And they ended up giving me my novice test. So I got, but they were the ones that really got me peeked into that. And then things just kept going forward. And over the years, I progressed up to extra, of course. But that was my real first introduction where I could sit and listen day after day when I wanted to on the ham radio.
So before I move on to Ed, you bring up a good question for me, Joe, and that is, there's different levels of operational certification for ham radio. I'm not familiar with them.
Yeah, Joe got his license when you had to know the Morse code. You don't need the Morse code anymore. But Joe, you learned to copy CW, didn't you?
Yeah, no, I did. It's actually my favorite way of operating now. I'm much more into CW than I am the sideband, but I enjoy all the contests. I really got started out contesting on sideband, and then I realized I was missing half of the contest by not getting the CW. So that's when I was fortunate just a couple of years after I got licensed to get exposed to that. And yeah, when I got my license, there was 5 levels. Now there's only 3. But you start out as a novice, and I think it's technician now. I think they've done away with the novice, and then you go into general and extra. They've done away with the other 2 levels, so it's a little simpler. They've done away with the code requirements, and that was always scary going into the FCC offices, trying to copy there, and your hands are shaking so much. It's, I'm playing in front of millions of guys, and I'm scared to death trying to take a test.
But so. If you have like a technician, does that mean like you can't get a certain radio and use it if you don't have the next level of certification and pass the test? Or
exactly, as you went up the levels, novice test was mainly just to get you exposed to radio. I think Ted, you're going to have to help me remember a little bit, or Ed there. I think you had maybe 10 meters that the novice could get on back then, and then you went to the technician.
You basically were limited in frequencies. Originally, the technician would not allow you on the HF bands. It was only the very, very UHF, ultra high frequency and above, where you could only talk maybe 20 or 30 miles. The real fun was at the HF high frequency bands, and of course Morse code or CW goes farther around the world on limited power than sideband. So as you got the higher levels of license, you got more spectrum privileges, more radio privileges that allowed you to use more frequencies that are better at night and day, and more bands. And of course, extra was the highest, and you had basically unlimited use of the various frequencies from HF, which are the frequencies that Marconi used, the very low frequencies, the very large wavelengths, 160 meter band. All the way up to very, very high UHF, VHF microwave, and even millimeter wave, where moon bounce is done.
Wow. So Ed, being here on Long Island, I'm going to have to rely on you to help us get through that process. But Ed, tell us how you got involved with ham radio and at what age?
I got involved listening to local emergency communications at probably about the age of 5. My uncle, who was a fire department member, FDNY member, gave me a handheld crystal scanner, and I was able to listen to all the different fire department frequencies in New York City. From then, I moved on to a programmable scanner where I started monitoring the NYPD frequencies. And then eventually I started scanning through the spectrum, and I found these guys talking about all sorts of crazy things on the local 2-meter repeaters.
Ed, were you young then, or were you an adult?
I was young. I probably found ham radio probably about 13 or 14 years old.
Yeah.
Started doing some investigations on it, and then I learned that there was a Morse code requirement. I tried to learn it, and it just wasn't for me. So I kind of pushed the ham radio desire to the side. Continued monitoring the local emergency communications. And then sometime in the early 90s, they did away with the Morse code requirement. And I came into the hobby as a no-code technician. And that was probably about 1993. And I predominantly used just VHF and UHF frequencies. I didn't really get into HF or upgrade my license up until last year. So.
And has that how much has that changed your use of radio as you've upgraded your license? Is it a different broadcast that you're focused on now, or are you speaking to different folks, or what are you concentrating on?
Well, I predominantly still use VHF and UHF. I do have HF privileges, which I do use sometimes. I like to play around on 17 meters. That seems to be my favorite band of choice as of late. So a lot more global communications are available using RF on the HF frequencies than on the more local VHF and UHF.
Mark, what I think is amazing is in all of our stories, we all have been ham radio operators for many decades. And what's incredible is Joe Rudi learned about ham radio in Venezuela before long distance and the internet was inexpensive. I mean, Joe was using a phone patch, which was using ham radio to carry non-business phone calls, from LA to Venezuela. And a lot of the ham radio operators of the 1970s and 80s became the engineers that built the cellular telephone industry and the internet. There are so many famous hams that built the wireless companies, the internet companies that all got into ham radio through one way or another.
I'm going to dial it back for a second in terms of thinking of the world before wireless communication, before ham radio, before cell phones. We're the Tesla Science Center. Nikola Tesla was really enthralled with the potential opportunity of wireless communications. And as early as 1901, was experimenting on wireless communications and remote control, being able to wirelessly communicate with what he called the teleautomaton, but a remote controlled boat. And when you think about the public that, couldn't fathom, at the turn of the 20th century, a boat being controlled remotely, when he brought that boat for exhibition at Madison Square Garden, they accused him of having a trained monkey inside, because it's akin to, telling you, excuse me for 1 second, I'm going to go behind this tree and teleport to Mars. They just couldn't fathom that kind of technology. And, but between his work and Marconi's work, how much have any of you looked at some of that early work and that history since becoming involved with amateur radio?
Yeah, I'll go first because I was fascinated with it. I read about Marconi and about Tesla and about Fessenden and DeForest. It was really when I started teaching in the late 1980s, I became fascinated with it and became involved with the Radio Club of America, the world's oldest radio society. And I was very fortunate early in my career to win the Marconi Young Scientist Award in 1990. So I was 29 years old. And I got to meet Marconi's living oldest daughter, Gioia Marconi Braga. And we became pen pals for many years. And so I read a lot about Marconi and how he developed, and even heard from his daughter how that whole enterprise evolved. And then, of course, Tesla and Marconi were contemporaries, all vying for funding for their entrepreneurial ideas. And what I find amazing is that these visionaries, Tesla, he predicted that all of us would be walking around with a mobile device. I think in the 1920s, maybe it was earlier. I remember reading something about Nikola Tesla. He predicted everyone would have a device where we would communicate around the world. So he was really prescient. He saw this. And I think it's, that's why I love research. I can work on things that maybe seem like science fiction today. People thought 5G and millimeter wave would be science fiction. That's the tip of the iceberg. But for me, I've always been inspired by the Nikola Teslas of the world. And I think it's great. There's a museum and energy meant to keep the memory and the accomplishments and the vision of Tesla and Marconi and others alive. I think it's important. It's important, especially for youth, I think, to realize that they can change the world.
I'm really enthralled with the fact that a lot of you mentioned that a lot of the folks that have been involved with connecting us through cell phones were originally ham radio enthusiasts, and so what potentially is behind that correlation? Is it that they just happen to be fascinated with all things wireless, or are there building blocks within the learning the ham radio process and how it works, where it's easier for their mind to go to a point where they understand RF engineering and what's needed for cellular.
Well, I'll comment, and I'm sure Ed and Joe have other thoughts because they came at the hobby a different way and they've seen much more, I'm sure, than I have. But what I've seen is when youth get excited about something and start mastering the capability, they gain more confidence. As human beings, it's hard to like what you don't know. But as you get to know something and you find out you enjoy it or you're good at it, it's very easy to take that into your career and into what you do for a living and the contributions you make. I can think of so many amazing ham radio operators as kids who changed the world for us. Fred Terman, who was the dean at Stanford, who created Silicon Valley, was a ham when he was young. Collins Radio, Collins, a great company. He was a youngster doing ham radio when he was young, messing with tubes. Walter Cronkite, the world's most recognized newscaster, was a ham radio operator, and he wound up going into broadcast. Owen Garriott, the famous astronaut who's been on the space shuttle and made ham radio contacts. I got to work him on a 2-meter radio when I was a student at Purdue. The astronaut flying around the world with ham radio. I think that you get into it young, and so you just get comfortable with it. Computers, radio, it's all there in the hobby of ham radio. But others like Ed and Joe came and saw it in a totally different way. So they probably have a different perspective.
Ed, Joe, have you seen a light turn on, not only obviously within yourselves as you got turned on to ham radio, but have you seen it in young people getting involved with ham radio?
I know I have. I feel that the spirit of ham radio is based on building things and experimenting. I wholeheartedly believe that the original hackers were ham radio operators. And with some of the projects that I'm involved with lately, we see an incoming of these younger hacker culture type of people coming into the hobby, especially with the open source project that I'm involved with now. So it's great to see the youth coming in and not necessarily just coming in for some of the older modes like single sideband and working CW, but some of the newer, more fascinating stuff like working satellites, working some of these digital modes, and building their own equipment.
Yeah, it's sort of the same way. I've met thousands of hams over my 45 years of being a ham now, and I can't tell you. I wish I'd have kept track, but it'd be impossible. A number of them that I met that were electrical engineers. They started out, in their younger years, getting into ham radio, getting exposed to that technology, and piqued their interest, and it just led them down that career of getting their EE and moving on to so many different facets. It's just it's a great thing about ham radio is there's something for everybody. I mean, all the way from my side, which I love contesting, all the way up into the very high frequency stuff like we're talking about moon bounce and all the different new technical things. They've got what they call FT8 now, which is computers talking to computers at levels we can't even hear, like 20, 30 dB below are being able to hear. The computers are able to talk to each other all over the world on very low power, very small antenna. As I moved down here to Florida, I had to give up my big station, and I just have a very simple 20-foot flagpole antennas, just a vertical piece of metal sticking up. And especially on FT8, I've worked all over the world, which is still mind-blowing to me at my old age that I can do this. So there's just so many facets. And so I think as these kids get involved at an early age, which we've tried to get them to do, I had 4 children. I was only able to get my oldest son to get his ham license. And so he's mainly on VHF and UHF out of his car now. But anyway, it's a great hobby, as I've said before, and there's just something for everybody.
Yeah, and as
hobby of hobbies.
Joe pointed out, he built an amazing contest station, which is lots of towers and lots of antennas, and I've done that too. It's so exciting to do that as a pastime, and you don't have to be technical. You get into ham radio and you learn about it. You learn about it from others. It's a very social network. In fact, you can go around the world, and any ham radio operator on the world, there's about 3.5 million of us licensed by our governments in hundreds of countries. It's like it's a fraternity. A ham radio operator in any country it's virtually, you've got an instant friend. And not people are not technical, but they build these stations. And Joe has he had an amazing contest station, and very famous, big signal, could talk around the world. And I've built one in my rural home in Virginia on top of a mountain. You know, it's kind of a fun part-time thing to do. You don't have to be technical. There's this worldwide community and always a local community of people that will help you get involved, lend you equipment, provide expertise. It's just a fascinating way to learn and keep up with things. And there's so many facets, as Joe and Ed said, from emergency communication and helping out local marathon races in your community to passing emergency traffic or sensing where things are. Ham radio is so diverse, and it's a great hobby.
There's a couple of questions that just come right out of that, and I was thinking it, you know, Ed, yeah, this is a hobby, but you know, Ted mentioned it and you mentioned it. This is an essential communication device when in an emergency, especially when communications go down. And I know that, you know, that's one of the things that you're interested in is the emergency services aspects. You know, can you give us any instances, you know, whether you've experienced them or you know of them, where ham radio became an essential communication tool?
I'll give you a couple from my personal involvement. Like I said earlier, I was involved with radio. I got first license in the early 90s, and living on Long Island, I joined our local ARES group, which is the Amateur Radio Emergency Services. So in 1995 and 1996, I was called to help provide communications for two pretty big events that happened on Long Island. One of them were the wildfires that affected the east end of Long Island. So we provided lots of communications for a period of about 3 or 4 weeks there. And then the following year, TWA Flight 800 crashed off the South Shore of Long Island. And again, I was called to provide and help with the emergency communications for that event. Since that time, I have trained and volunteered my time for non-emergency events, but leading up to the potential to use them in case of an emergency. And like Ted said, helping out in marathons like the New York City Marathon, or just some of the local 5K runs that are held throughout the local area. And I'm still involved in the Amateur Radio Emergency Services. I serve as the Assistant Emergency Coordinator for my town here on Long Island. And I am also involved with the CERT group, which is the Community Emergency Response Team, where I serve as the radio officer for the county CERT program.
Oh. Ted, Joe, similar stories to Ed's in terms of, have you seen ham radio, you know, in an essential service when communications go down or in an emergency situation?
I guess I'll go next. I've just had a couple of instances. I played with the California Angels from 77 through 1980, and we were living in Laguna Beach, very close to the ocean. And this was pretty early on. I think at the time, I probably only had a general or advanced class license at that time. And I used to come home after, you know, the ball games, get home 11:30, midnight or so, and grab a couple glasses of wine. And I had a basement station, and I would go down there and turn on the radio. It was my way of unwinding, relaxing after a ball game. And one of the nights I went down there, I heard a boat down the Caribbean actually calling for help, and they were taking on water. And I was able to call the local Coast Guard station there in Southern California. And back then you could dial the operator and say, "Can you connect me to the Coast Guard station?" I told them what frequency I was listening on, talking to these guys, and they were able to connect with the people down in Florida and actually go out and rescue these guys. The other time that I did any kind of phone patch stuff at all was back, I can't even remember the year now, but when Mexico had the huge earthquake. I don't know what it was, 15, 20 years ago. Time flies by, but there was a big need for safety and welfare messages being passed back and forth, people trying to contact family and friends down there. A lot of Americans, of course, go down to Mexico and spend the winters or have actually moved down there. So those are the two main periods that I was involved, that I actually did anything during emergencies.
Wow, Joe, that's amazing. you saved a ship at sea. That's pretty incredible.
One time in 45 years.
Yeah, but it's great you did that. You were at the right time and the right place, kind of like when you were a baseball player.
Hey, you who stays up all night, never know what you're going to find when you go fishing that lake.
Well, there's been so many well-documented success stories of ham radio saving the day, but I remember one vividly because it happened to myself. I was a very young professor. We had just had our third child born, and we decided to take our first family vacation ever. I think it was 1990. We had a brand new minivan, and we drove down to the west coast of Florida. We were going to take a vacation. I was working hard as a professor, assistant professor, working for tenure, so I wasn't getting much time off, and I was trying to build this new research program in wireless. And I was doing a company also, so we needed a break. We drove down in the family minivan, had a great vacation, and on the way up from Florida back to Virginia Tech on the interstate, we're driving along in northern Florida, and all of a sudden, I'm in the traffic on the interstate, and a semi-truck in front of me drops a giant angle iron. It's like 12 feet wide and 6 inches tall, and I couldn't avoid hitting it. And our van went right over that angle iron, and it sheared off the gas tank, which I had just filled up, full tank of gas, and it ripped the entire gas tank and spilled 20 gallons of gas on the interstate. I had no power. I lost control, but was able to get, miraculously, grace of God, got the van over to the side. Luckily, no one wrecked. It was horrifying, but there we are, stranded in northern Florida on the side of an interstate with no car and no power. Well, thankfully, I'm a ham radio operator. I had my trusty handy talkie, and I got on the local repeater on 2 meters. This is before everyone had cell phones. In fact, I was doing research on cell phones, and my hometown, Blacksburg, Virginia, did not yet even have cell phones, or maybe only a few people had it. But luckily, through the grace of God and the ability of ham radio, I was able to make a call, and a local ham drove right out to me, called AAA, and the ham radio community took us in, helped us find a hotel. We were stranded for 2 days because they had to ship the part in for the gas tank to the local repair shop. But if it weren't for ham radio, I don't know what would have happened. It was starting to be nightfall. So that's just a typical example of, I think, ham radio, how it helped people before the cell phone industry, and it's still valuable when you don't have cell phone coverage.
That's remarkable. That's a harrowing experience. Some of these stories reminded me, the Titanic. There's a lot of connectivity to the Titanic between Marconi and Tesla. In fact, when the Titanic sank, we said that Marconi and Tesla were contemporaries, and we are committed to telling the story of Tesla and his contemporaries as accurately as possible. People see them as, were they adversaries and competitors, and to an extent that they were, but they were also somewhat collegial with each other. Tesla, on a flip side, outside of wireless, people see Tesla versus Edison and AC versus DC, and sometimes the stories around them that surround them are embellished or changed. It's almost like playing the game of telephone. They've been told so many times as folklore that they've changed. So for us as a science center, we're trying to study the facts and report them as accurately as possible so we can learn from them. And a lot of the folks that are involved with the Tesla Science Center, like Ted, or like Vint Cerf, one of the fathers of the internet, and Marty Cooper, the inventor of the cell phone, who Ted and Vint had introduced us to. They all have been involved with the Marconi Society for a number of years as well. So my understanding is Tesla came up with a lot of the foundational building blocks for wireless. Marconi moved very fast. He utilized some of those building blocks that Tesla created, and it might have been with Tesla's blessing, because they were collegial, for a while until the money followed Marconi, and then there were patent battles. But so from our standpoint, Marconi, I think he used like 17 of Tesla's technologies, but he got that signal off, and that's important. There, and as Ted alluded to, there's this, they both were looking for funding to do wireless, and Tesla here at the lab that we are preserving and opening to the public, this was supposed to be the epicenter of wireless. He had a 187-foot tower that he was funded by JP Morgan to do wireless communication to Europe. And Marconi got the signal off. He did Morse code. Tesla was trying to do two-way voice like ham radio with multiple channels. And Morgan calls Tesla on the carpet and asks, how did this guy beat you? And Tesla's like, he didn't. He's doing something different. So it's simpler. I'm trying to do two-way voice. And JP Morgan was like, I didn't need that. I just needed Morse code. I just needed to know the New York Stock Exchange ticker tape, when I'm in London. And then Tesla, came out and said, I also think I could do wireless transmission of electricity with the same towers. And we'll get into that in a little bit. And Morgan, what do I need that for? How do you make money off of that? You can't meter it. So there's a couple of different stories that we're trying to research, where either Morgan was concerned with wireless transmission of electricity, that it would compete with the transmission distribution system Tesla already invented, that Morgan and a lot of his companies were selling rubber and copper into the wired system for transmission of electricity. So he was concerned and upset and did what he could to ruin Tesla. Or the other side of that story is that Morgan just saw it as too risky and had no interest in investing, and Tesla was having a hard time raising capital after Marconi was able to get that transmission off. But I mentioned that we were talking about the boat sinking, and Joe, you were able to help save the people on that boat with radio. Well, when the Titanic went down, Tesla's star set because Jacob Astor was on the Titanic, and he was a very good friend of Tesla's and a potential investor in Tesla's wireless, and he died on the Titanic. And his brother took over the Waldorf Astoria where Tesla lived, and had run up some debts, and they ended up booting him out of the Waldorf Astoria, taking over this property, knocking down his tower. But when that Titanic went down, there was a Marconi system on board, and they were able to use wireless communication and the radio to communicate that it was going down. And there were boats in the area that were able to come to the location and at least save some of those passengers. And so Marconi stock rose in the wireless community as a result of that. So, Ted has heard me say that we want to look at wireless past, present, future. And I'm not going to get into too much cellular here today, but, for wireless, for ham radio, what is the future of ham radio? Is there new innovation that we should be looking towards that, we're not even thinking of, that will continue to make ham radio more than a hobby, but an essential service?
I only know a tiny bit compared to Ed's involvement in the VHF, UHF stuff. But like I said, the one thing now, this FT8 and the ability to, in an emergency with very small antennas, very low power, being able to communicate almost around the world, depending on what band you're on, and pass messages back and forth, way below the level that we could hear with our ears. And there's so many different ones. I don't even haven't really gotten into the whisper, and there's all these other different VHF, UHF type things they're doing. And of course, we have our own satellites, ham radio satellites up there that people communicate through still. And, you know, as I said, I think a lot of the hams that have gone through this period, and a lot of us are getting older now and are not able to keep up the big stations. And it's just as ham radio technologies improves, like I said, I'm here from a fairly large station to just a simple 20-foot tall piece of metal. And I'm able to talk all over the world with the new technology they have now. So I think it's going to continue to grow. And, you know, technology continuously changes, and ham radio has always been on the forefront of that.
Yeah, K1JT, Joe Taylor, is a Nobel Prize winner, astronomist, radio astronomist, who has developed a lot of these amazing computer modes that Joe mentioned, Whisper, WSPR, and FT8, FT4, that allow digital communications to computer on very low power, 20 watts, 100 watts, to go all over the world. But there are amazing innovations continuing to happen in ham radio, and it's really ham radio that's led the wireless and internet revolution, and it continues. For example, the original phone patch that Joe and I used when we were hams in the 80s and the 70s led to cellular telephone. Packet radio, the idea of packet radio, that originated in ham radio, and then it became adopted throughout the entire internet. And that's now how all voice calls are done in the cellular industry. Hams for decades have been pioneering this radio spectrum up at millimeter wave and sub-terahertz frequencies. Those will be key frequencies for 6G and 7G cell phones 10, 20 years from now. That's going to happen. And and continuing to develop infrastructure equipment that allows basic science to happen. There's a huge effort funded by the National Science Foundation, and it's ham radio operators who are professors that are building low-cost channel sounders to sound the ionosphere, to figure out what's happening several hundred kilometers above us and what the solar energy does to our ionosphere. Space weather. Turns out space weather can affect how well satellites work, how well our electrical equipment works. It may hold the key to the future of the global climate change. Ham radio operators are building the equipment that becomes low cost and easy to use, and then is used for, as Joe said, experimental purposes. And hams continue to do that. And it's a great platform where the hobby is actually dedicated to hobbyists. It's not for business, but it creates this great playground of radio frequencies to build anything you want, to try anything you want, and with this global community. And Ed, you've probably seen other things as well in the emergency field.
Yes, my primary interest in communications is VHF and UHF, and I have been, since I got back into the hobby a few years ago, I've been involved in a lot of the digital voice modes, DMR, D-Star, Yaesu Fusion, and the new open source mode that I'm involved with is M17, which is a new digital radio protocol for voice and data. So we've been doing a lot of work there. My knowledge base has grown tremendously working with some of the individuals in that field and seeing some of the visions that they have to take these new technologies into space, doing a lot of satellite work, which I'm starting to get involved with now myself. So definitely a lot of great things I see on the horizon for amateur radio. And the more younger people that we get involved with this, we're going to have another revolution of the next technology out there. And it's going to once again be started in the ham radio community.
Yeah, and I think having high school teachers and college teachers and grade school teachers getting kids used to the idea of wireless and electronics, that could only help us. To your point, Ed, getting the youth involved, I think there's a huge opportunity and lots of resources there.
The STEM curriculum is definitely going to boost the ham radio community in the future, and that's something I'd like to get more involved with, becoming a mentor to some of these younger high school students and maybe grade school students who do have an interest in wireless and some of the other technologies such as robotics and whatnot. And I can help as much as I can. And if I don't understand it, I'd be more than happy to learn it and pass the knowledge on to the future of this great hobby.
And that, the limited knowledge I have, so I am not a ham radio operator, but I do aspire to be one.
Not yet, Mark, not yet.
Exactly. I do aspire to be one. But hanging out with you guys over the past few years, and talking to folks like, Ted, our friend Vint Cerf, working at Google now, I know one of the projects they're looking at, and I think he's working on, is using a form of ham radio for interplanetary communications. Knowing that some of the largest tech companies in the world are looking at, what happens when we do colonize Mars and how are we communicating? And it's not going to be a cell phone call. It's going to have to be a ham radio. And if that is our future, however far away it is, not only do we have to get the next generation excited about this kind of communication and understanding it so that they can innovate, there's going to be a whole new level of jobs around this. And it's not just a hobby.
It often leads to a great career. In fact, there are still companies, engineering companies, where if a kid comes in and he or she has a ham radio license, it's almost a guaranteed job, because you learn so much by doing, by experimenting, by gaining intuition. That's what the hobby of ham radio allows someone who's young to do. And so parents, teachers, I think they all embrace the hobby. It's just, Ed, we need more of you. You've inspired me to get out there and get into the schools. I'm trying to get W2NYU set up. I've got a good administration which is going to let me get the ham radio system going back up, the station back up at NYU, but getting at the high school.
I know what I can do to help.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm close enough.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. But what's amazing is even if people find it later in life, it's such a fulfilling hobby where you can meet so many amazing people. Like through ham radio, I've met my baseball hero, Joe Rudi. Joe, I watched you when I was a kid in Indiana. I watched you in the World Series. I mean, where can you meet an all-star baseball player? Or Joe Walsh, the guitarist and songwriter for the Eagles. He's a ham operator. King Hussein of Jordan, I talked to him on the radio when he was King Hussein, JY1, and Barry Goldwater, elected politician from Arizona. Yeah, he was in Arizona, I think. I mean, ham radio operators come from all walks of life, and it builds the soft skills, the social skills when you're young, getting into the hobby of just meeting people from other walks of life. And I feel very blessed to have been in this hobby. It's just been far beyond the technical aspect. It's a community, and indeed ham radio operators do lead the way, and ham radio will be on Mars. I'm sure of it, because every technological revolution has had hams leading the way.
That's remarkable. So we're coming up on an hour, and you've all been very generous with your time. I guess. Are you
going to let me, Mark? Are you going to let me ask Joe Rudi what are some of his most memorable plays are in baseball? Because I'm dying to know that. I saw so many of them.
I was going to say, what were the questions that we didn't ask that you want to ask now? And I didn't get a chance to say that, but that is exactly the point that we're at. So Ted, good segue. So Joe, do you have any comment on that?
The one thing I always want to add on to what was being said here is that, there's so many of the colleges that have had ham radio stations set up at their colleges for years and years and years that have promoted the same growth at the colleges. And so I worked many of those, as I'm sure all of us have. And in my opinion, trying to get across to the general population that people understand that these cell phones they're walking around with are basically two-way radios. They're just on a different set of frequencies than we use. And just like the police have their own frequencies, the military has their own frequencies, that the spectrum is sort of like a ruler. It goes from 0 to infinity, and there are little segments chopped along that line that are given to different entities. And, again, cell phones are just another two-way radio. Getting back to baseball, I guess, again, my most memorable ones are, of course, from the World Series days. And I think going back to the catch I made in 1972 in Cincinnati, I don't know how much you have, but, I
was a big Reds fan. That was the most amazing catch I think I've ever seen.
Well, it was set up by a lot of years. I signed out of high school at 17. I was playing shortstop, never played the outfield. Played a little bit of third base in the minors, not much outfield. I went actually from A ball to the big leagues in 1967. And when they first put me in the outfield out there, I went to a major league ballpark. The hitter looked like an ant. He was so far away. And so it took me quite a few years, and I was very blessed when we moved to Oakland in 1968. We had a gentleman by the name of Joe DiMaggio that agreed to become a coach with the A's for 68 and 69. And we had a manager named Bob Kennedy, and he and Joe DiMaggio sort of took me under their wing. And every day from the beginning of spring training all the way through the season, or if we had a night game with a doubleheader the next day, Bob would stand over by the third base coaching box. Joe would be in the outfield with me, and they would hit fly balls and start teaching me. And I remember, especially in spring training, Joe trying to teach me how to go back on that very play. And I would turn and run to a spot, and the ball would be 50 feet over that direction. It took me thousands and thousands of plays with Joe trying to teach me how to go back and turn on the ball, learn the line, where the ball is curving. And that same play that I made in the World Series, I practiced that 10,000 times with Joe.
Wow.
Joe did 2 years. And it's just one of those fascinating things. And I think my other big moment that comes to mind was the home run in the 74 World Series that clinched the World Series against the Dodgers off of Mike Marshall. They had the big ruckus in left field. Bill Buckner had made a comment back in those days that there was only a couple of players, Reggie Jackson and Catfish Hunter, that could have made their roster. He put that in the paper, talking about, fuel for getting people up. And so that was a big blow up in the Oakland papers. And so in that fifth game, he had hit a double, trying to stretch it into a triple, got thrown out at third base in the top of the seventh. So when he went up, he was playing left field also, went out to left field in Oakland, and the fans just showered him with beer cups and you name it, they threw on the field. So there was like a 15-minute delay during that time, cleaning up the garbage, and the announcer telling the fans to quiet down and blah, blah, blah. And during that whole period of time, Mark Marshall never threw a pitch, did not do one warm-up pitch.
Wow.
And so he said, I don't need it, let's go. And so I figured he had a great screwball, which was almost unhittable. And I said, well, he can't throw that with, waiting that long. So I was looking for a fastball inside. And he threw it there, and I hit the home run. That was the clinching run that, won the World Series on that 3-2 on that home run. And so those are my two high points of my career that I remember the most of doing that. And like I said, that none of us ever get there by ourselves. We've all had great teachers and so many great coaches over my career in baseball, and the same thing in ham radio. I can't even begin to list the number of people, because I have no technical background at all. I did very little on the inside of the station. I was mainly the tower builder and putting the antennas up and stuff on the outside. And so the hundreds of guys that I spent hours on the phone asking them how to do this, how to do that. And that's the great thing, as you said before, about ham radio, is there's just an unlimited number of people out there that are willing to help you.
Is that your World Series trophy that's to your right, to our left, and the gold glove next to it? And what's that bat above the top wall?
The bat up the top is one of my treasured things of Yogi Berra. Was just a great guy, and got to talk to him many, many times when we was in the Yankees. And of course, he was coaching the Mets in '73. And I got him to sign that bat and the ball for me. So that's Yogi Berra's bat and stuff. The picture right below that is a picture of Babe Ruth and Yogi. I wish I had those both signed.
Wow.
But Yogi was one of my idols. He was just a tremendous guy. You're talking about somebody that was persona on TV and stuff. He was exactly like that off the field. Just funnier than heck.
That's great.
Amazing. That made my day.
Thank you for sharing
Made
that.
all of our days, yeah. Ed, any closing comments on your end?
I just want to say that for those who aren't involved at radio, hopefully that this sparked a little interest in them. And feel free to reach out to one of your local radio clubs or reach out to the Amateur Radio Relay League and find out how you can get licensed in your local area and join this great hobby. I've had the pleasure of meeting lots of great people in the hobby and getting to play around with some really cool cutting edge technology and experimenting and building antennas and radios and whatnot. And it's just been a blast. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me here today, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Ted.
thank you,
Thank you,
Mark.
Joe. This was really appreciate all the time and the conversation today, and look forward to continuing that conversation. Maybe next year in celebration of National Radio Day again, we could reconvene and we'll invite more friends that we mentioned today on the call.
Great.
That's 73 in Morse code. That means best wishes.
73, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. It was an invigorating conversation on a technology and a hobby that not only helps spawn innovation, but has a tremendous future. The Tesla Science Center will be working with our local radio club, Ed and his members, to get more and more involved, which makes a lot of sense for the Tesla Science Center to be involved with the amateur radio movement. So if you're listening to today's broadcast, please reach out to us if you have an interest in ham radio, and we'll continue to compile a list of folks that need training or who want to be networked with the individuals in this movement. Thank you so much.